Hello, good evening.
Hello, Abby. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How about you?
Yes, I'm very well, thanks.
Yeah. You want to get your slides up and ready? Let's see if they work.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed currently to turn on my camera, so if you could.
Oh yeah. I will. Yeah, one sec. I'll just be clicking that now.
Yeah, no worries.
You should be able to do it now.
Yep, all good. Give me one moment. There we go. Is that visible?
Yeah. Visible.
Okay,
Let's give it a few minutes before we get started.
sure. While I'm here, let me turn on my video.
Can we please have videos and mics turned off, please? Anyone else? I mean, yeah. Thanks. How's university? Are you back yet?
I am just about back, yes. I'm starting my PhD on Monday morning, so it's all
Is it
starting to
3 years,
kick
right?
off. 4 years for me. I've got a special one where I do like an extra little bit of an internship in between. So I'm sort of only halfway through university at this point, which is a strange thought.
Good luck.
Thanks very much.
I think we can get started at 6:05. I'm expecting like between 30 and 35 people.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get started, I want to go through a few key points that are outlined in the email with the joining link. First of all, the chat will only be turned on at the end of the talk for the Q&A session. Please keep your video cameras and microphones turned off. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties throughout the talk, please email us, and any inappropriate or irrelevant questions will result in an immediate removal from the call. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Our guest tonight here is a PhD student from the University of Cambridge, with a background in the natural sciences. He's appeared several times on the BBC Radio Cambridge's The Naked Scientist show and has given talks to the Cambridge University Physics Society. Additionally, he served on the teaching committee of the Institute of Astronomy. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Xander Byrne.
Hello, thanks very much. So what I'm going to do today, as mentioned by Abby, I'm an astronomer. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about astronomy in general as a research field. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of the research projects that I've done in this area, in this talk entitled Worlds Anew, Quasars, Exoplanets, and the Search for Life. So I think first and foremost, it's worth saying that astronomy is certainly one of the oldest areas of science. You know, it's pretty much inevitable that when our ancestors would have been, cuddling up and looking at the night sky for all those thousands of years ago, we would inevitably have felt an incredibly strong sense of curiosity as we tried to understand what all of these lights in the sky are. But don't just take my word for it. This image here is a picture of an artifact called the Nebra sky disk. It's made of, it dates back to the Bronze Age. So this is roughly sort of 1700 BC. And it was discovered in 1999 near the German town of Nebra. And it's clear that even going back into the Bronze Age, there was quite a lot of astronomy being done. There's a few icons on this list which are on this plate rather, which are a little bit cryptic, but there's certainly some which are pretty obvious what's going on here. We've got this big dish here in the middle, which is almost certainly the sun. We've got a crescent moon near the bottom, and we've got loads and loads of small dots dotted around these objects, no doubt representing stars. We even think that this sort of cluster of 7 stars here, just down to the sort of slightly right of center, probably represents the 7 stars of the Pleiades star cluster, what's known as an open cluster, just over 440 light years away. And this cluster is easily visible on a clear night from the northern hemisphere. And I often like to wonder, what were the forgers of this disk thinking about when they were deciding what to put on it? It's clearly must have been of some importance to them if they make this such a long-lasting artifact. And I wonder if they were thinking about, why are some of these stars on their own? Why are some of them grouped together? How do the sun and the moon relate to the stars, if at all? And the forgers of this disk were part of a very, very long tradition of looking at the night sky with a sense of fear, a sense of insignificance, as well as a sense of curiosity. We have all of these beautiful lights in the night sky. It's an incredibly natural, incredibly human thing to look at them and wonder, how far away are they? What's producing this light? Why are, as I say, some stars by themselves and some grouped together? What is this mysterious band of particularly bright region of the sky? And it's only really in the last 100 years or so that we've really started to get a good understanding of our place in the cosmos. In just the last couple of centuries, we've been able to understand that these points of light in the sky are each objects very similar to our own sun. They only appear much less bright because they're much further away. we've been able to categorize these stars and learn that they are not all exactly the same, but each has their own little quirks due to what they're made of and their temperature, how big they are. We know that this band across the sky is the galaxy of stars which we inhabit and which our sun is a member. We know also that each of these points in the night sky, or almost all of them, probably has some of their own planets in orbits around them. We've learned, and this is something we've only learned in the last couple of decades, that planets are not rare at all. Almost every star you see in the night sky will almost certainly have at least a few planets in orbit around it, which is a pretty incredible thought. And with recent technological developments as well, we are able to look beyond even our own galaxy to the faintest objects that are even further away. We've recently been able to find out that not only are there trillions and trillions of other galaxies out there beyond our own, each with their own ensembles of hundreds of billions of stars, each with a few planets around them. We know that there are this many galaxies, and we're able to say that these galaxies are able to cluster together somewhat into clusters. So also, if we look at galaxies beyond our own cluster of galaxies, we find that they are not being drawn towards us by gravity, but rather they are receding away from us at phenomenal speeds. And the further we look away, the faster galaxies are moving away from us. It's quite an incredible thought. And we're also, rather than just being able to tell the universe, tell people what the universe is today, we're able to tell an incredibly detailed story of what the universe's past was and what its future might entail. If everything is moving away from us today, then that means that at some point in the past, all of the matter must have been very, very close together. And from this and other observations, we now know that the entire universe, all of the matter in existence, was all together in an incredibly dense and incredibly hot state, which quickly expanded and cooled, allowing atoms to form, allowing molecules to form, and allowing clouds of molecules to condense to form stars, stars to group together to form galaxies, and to give the universe in which we see it today. But nonetheless, despite all of this incredible advancement, despite all this amazing ability that we have used to delineate what there is in the universe around us, what this cosmos has in store for us, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. Galaxies are bigger than we can see. There is a lot more mass in there than that is producing light. We don't know what that mass is, so we call it dark matter. Similarly, we can see that distant galaxies are moving away from us, but we don't know what's causing them to do that. So we call this cause dark energy. Aside from these sort of more glaring problems, there are philosophical problems which astronomy seeks to address as well. With these trillions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, each with several planets, could it be the case that some of them are able to support life? Could we be one of many intelligent species out there in the universe? Would we one day be able to have a conversation with intelligent life, perhaps similar to our own? These are the questions which drive astronomers, have driven astronomers throughout the centuries and continue to drive us today. Often in quite small steps, but nonetheless, these are the questions which we are working towards answers to. So what I'm going to do in this talk is talk about a couple of the small steps that I've made towards answering some of these questions. I'm going to talk about two research projects that I've done. The first is searching for objects called lensed high redshift quasars. There is only one of these objects known, and we were looking for some more of these. And the second was work I did for my master's project, exploring surface-atmosphere interactions on warm, rocky exoplanets. So let's dive right in. The first project I was going to talk about, the full title of this project was Finding Lens High Redshift Quasars Using Unsupervised Machine Learning. If you take nothing else away from this talk, then you should take away the fact that astronomers are really, really bad when it comes to naming things and using jargon. And so I think there's pretty much every word in this title requires a bit of explanation. So I'm just going to go through what I mean by all of these terms here. So the first thing to obviously think about is, what do we mean by quasars? So quasars are the most luminous objects, full stop. They're the most luminous things that we know of in the entire universe. We can see them out tens of billions of light years away. They're phenomenally bright. At their core is what's described as a highly active supermassive black hole. You may be aware of black holes as objects which are so massive that light is unable to escape from them. But you may not know that black holes come in two different types. There are the stellar mass black holes, which might have a mass of something like a few tens of mass of solar masses. And these are the remnants of old stars that were large enough to go supernova and collapse gravitationally into a black hole. But there's another type of black hole, the supermassive black holes. And these are so massive that we find them at the centers of most galaxies. It's thought that they played a pivotal role in the assembly of all of these galaxies in the first place. Now, black holes, especially supermassive black holes, have naturally a phenomenal amount of gravity. They're incredibly gravitationally strong systems. And sometimes, if these black holes are able to tear apart stars that are unfortunate enough to cross into the vicinity, that are gas clouds that pass nearby, they don't usually just fall straight in. What usually happens is they get torn apart and spread out into disks, such as the one you can see in this image here. These are called accretion disks. And what happens in these accretion disks is the gas and other material spirals in very, very slowly, losing energy as it collides with other parts of the accretion disk. When that happens, this energy is released in the form of initially heating up the material here. So these disks get very, very hot. We're talking, like billions of degrees. And eventually, when you have something that hot, it becomes incredibly, incredibly luminous. So, and that is why we are able to see these things from, halfway across the universe, because they are just so hot as a result, ultimately, of the strong gravitational influence of these supermassive black holes. So that's what a quasar is. It's a supermassive black hole which is currently feasting and spewing out an enormous amount of radiation. So what do I mean then by high redshift? Well, as I mentioned, the universe is expanding. The distant galaxies are receding away from us. And as the light comes from those galaxies towards the Earth, that light actually gets expanded as well. The wavelength of that light increases as it travels from these distant galaxies towards us. Now, if we have light and we increase its wavelength, that means that it gets more red. Right? Red is the longest wavelength, at least, of visible light. And so when we talk about light having its wavelength stretched out, we call that redshift. Now, the further away the object we're looking at, the longer the light has taken to travel towards us. And so the further in the past that object, we're seeing that object. But also, it means that the light has had more time to be stretched by the expansion of the universe. And so the more distant the object, the more reddened its light becomes as a result of the expansion of the universe. So what we mean when we refer to high redshift objects is we're talking about objects that are very, very distant. And as a result, we're looking at them as they were a very, very long time ago. Usually, we're looking at high redshift objects in the sort of first billion years, or perhaps 2 billion years of the universe's 13.7 billion year history. So high redshift usually means kind of right into the kind of adolescence and childhood of our universe. Next, what do I mean by lens? Well, this is a phenomenon called gravitational lensing, which is a consequence of Einstein's theory of general relativity, which posits that gravity is not really a force like any other. It's actually a consequence of the deformation of space and time around very large masses. And so a key tenet of Einstein's theory is that gravity doesn't just affect matter, it doesn't just affect things, it also affects light. And so if we have some light from this sort of background source, as you can see here in the image, it will get deflected due to the gravitational influence of objects in the foreground, which in this case is a galaxy cluster. A couple of consequences of this is that sometimes we see the same object, which would be the background object, it will appear in two places at once, on either side, in this case, of the massive lensing object, this galaxy cluster. Another consequence is that it can magnify these objects. And that's particularly useful because we really want to be able to look at things further and further back in the universe's history. And we can only do that if they're bright enough for us to be able to see them. So by looking for lensed objects, it means that we are able to see them from further and further away because they're brighter than they ordinarily would be if there were not a gravitational lensing object in front there. So to sum up a little bit, what we mean by lensed high redshift quasars are quasars which are very, very far away and that have some kind of lensing object in front of them, which is making them a little bit more bright. So how can we find these? Well, typically when people are looking for high redshift quasars, not necessarily lensed ones, but high redshift quasars, we typically search for them by looking for objects which have a very particular color. And I'm putting color in inverted commas here because it's not particularly like this thing in the middle here is red and these other things are blue. It's a bit more detailed than that. We're looking at how bright these objects are through particular filters which we put over the telescopes. So we might be looking for an object which is very dim in like green filters, but might be a lot brighter in redder filters and infrared filters. So that's typically how we look for high redshift quasars in general. But there's a bit of a problem with this method when it comes to looking for lensed high redshift quasars. Because if it's lensed, then we've got something massive in the way. Often a lensing, just a single galaxy, will be in the way. And galaxies produce light of their own. So if we have a lensing system, if we have a lensed high redshift quasar, then we'll not only be looking at light from the quasar itself, but also light from the galaxy in front. And what this will do is it will pollute the color of that object. It will make it look, at least color-wise, like something else. And so we will typically throw this object away. We will think, okay, this is probably not a high redshift quasar because it has the wrong color, even though that is exclusively because there is a galaxy in front of it, which has nothing to do with it, really. So the goal of this project was to use a technique called unsupervised machine learning to help us find some of these lens systems and escape this problem of the lensing galaxy being in front. You will inevitably have heard a lot about machine learning and artificial intelligence. I believe the next talk in this series, for example, is on artificial intelligence. So if you're interested in this area, that would definitely be worth looking at. But I'll just briefly talk about, it's not what this talk is about, but I'll just give an introduction. Machine learning is essentially a way of automating programming to make it easier. So if we're trying to teach an AI to be able to tell the difference between images of cats and images of dogs, one approach would be to kind of hard code into that programming what a dog's ear looks like, what a cat's ear looks like, what a dog's nose looks like, what a cat's nose looks like. But that would be a very, very complicated process. And so ideally we would not want to do that. The advantage of machine learning is we can just give it loads of images of cats, tell it they're images of cats, and give it loads of images of dogs and tell it that they're images of dogs, and teach the neural network to change things in its internal structure until it is able to tell the difference very accurately. Now, the problem with most machine learning techniques is they need what are called data labels. So we need to tell the neural network, when we're training it, which images are of cats and which images are of dogs. And this is a very difficult thing to do in general. What we would have to do is we'd have to look, like a human would have to look at each image and tell the computer whether it would be a cat or a dog. If we give it sort of the wrong labels, then it will not learn very well at all, and it will just get completely wrong. Now, unsupervised machine learning is a type of machine learning which is designed to subvert this problem. What we do is, rather than teaching the neural network things, we just give it all of the data and we teach it to separate those data points into groups which look individually similar to other members of their own group. A big advantage of this procedure is that it doesn't require labels. So if we gave it loads of images of cats and dogs, we wouldn't have to tell it which was which. It would sort of figure out, it would sort of split them into two groups by themselves. It wouldn't be able to tell which one was cats and which ones were dogs, but it will have done all of the hard work separating those two out. So what we did was we trained an unsupervised neural network to be able to search for some of these high redshift quasars that are lensed. And we found this group of objects here. This is what the neural network separated a sample of objects out into. And you can see the sort of various groups here. There's one over here. Don't worry too much about the color scheme. Just notice that there are a few kind of blobs of where the neural network has identified that there are some groups that are quite similar to each other. And of particular importance is this top little group here, which I've got zoomed in the top right. There are 12 data points in here. 10 out of those 12 data points represent high redshift quasars that we already knew about. There are just two other objects here, these green dots, which no one had ever actually looked at before. Now, because the neural network has said that all of these objects together in the top right are very similar looking, we thought, well, maybe these other two objects would be worth a look. So we had a close look. We looked at them with a telescope in Chile, and we took the spectra of these two quasars, which is to say that we take all of the light and we split it up and see how much of each color we are getting. And so in these images, we have on the x-axis the wavelength of that light, the color of the light, and the y-axis is how much of that light we're getting. And the way to tell the spectrum of a high redshift quasar is it has a very sudden cliff in it. And when we looked at the spectra of these two objects, you can see images of them at the bottom. They both had a very sudden cliff in their spectra, which confirms these as two high redshift quasars that had never been discovered before, which is pretty cool. Furthermore, there are actually indications in these spectra that there might be a lensing galaxy in front of them. So these might be lensed high redshift quasars. And this is very interesting because there had only before been one example of a lensed high redshift quasar that had ever been discovered. And these two are potentially number 2 and number 3, which is pretty cool. So before you ask, I did not get to name these objects. They have very boring coordinate names like J0109-whatever, because as I say, astronomers are very bad at naming things. But it was still incredibly cool to be able to discover new objects that no one had ever found before. It was quite an incredible feeling when I got the email saying, you've discovered 2 new distant black holes which are violently spewing out radiation from across the cosmos. It's really quite an incredible feeling. Okay, so that was the first part of this. The second part, I'm going to talk about some of the research that I've done more recently for my master's project here at the University of Cambridge. So it's about surface-atmosphere interactions on warm, rocky exoplanets. Now, an exoplanet is a planet which orbits a star other than the Sun. It turns out that such objects are incredibly common. It turns out that pretty much every star you see in the night sky will probably have at least a few planets around it. I don't know how well you can see this, but since the mid-90s, when the first exoplanets were discovered, we found over 5,500 of these things around over 4,000 different stars. And if you can see sort of on the right-hand side of this in the sort of final column, we're discovering these planets on a sort of weekly basis. It's really an incredible stage that we're at as a species, where we've existed as a species for millions of years, and it's only now in the past couple of decades where we're at a stage where we are discovering new worlds. It's an incredible time to be alive, especially as an astronomer. Now, because planets, it turns out, are not that difficult to find, some astronomers have been looking for a new challenge. And so what they've been doing is trying to find out what some of these planets are like in a broad sense. The easiest thing to find out about a planet is what is in its atmosphere. And a good way of finding out what is in its atmosphere, what gases are there, is a method called transmission spectroscopy. So the way this works is, so this is the distant star in the background here. We wait for the planet in question to pass in front of its star. So it's blocking out some of the starlight from our point of view. What we can then do is we look at the light which filters through the atmosphere of that planet when it is blocking its star. And again, we can take a spectrum. We can look at what colors are coming through the atmosphere and what colors are being absorbed by particular chemical species, particular molecules that are there in the atmosphere. This gives us a kind of chemical fingerprint of what's there in the atmosphere of these planets. So, for example, if an alien were looking at Earth in transmission spectroscopy, they would see absorptions due to molecular oxygen here, O2. They would see absorption due to water, due to methane, and increasingly due to carbon dioxide. But we can do this for other planets. This is routinely done. And just a couple of weeks ago, we found that some researchers were looking at a planet called K2-18b. You may have heard about this. This was all over the news. And they took a transmission spectrum of this planet, and they found not only things like methane and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is pretty cool in itself, because this is the first time that carbon-bearing molecules were found in the habitable zone of a star. A bit more on that later. But there was also this chemical dimethyl sulfide, DMS, which was found to be probably present in this atmosphere. And the reason that's so exciting is because dimethyl sulfide on Earth is only produced by phytoplankton. It's only produced by life. So this is a tantalizing indicator that maybe there could be something biological going on this planet. So my sort of impression of what the next step forward would be in characterizing some of these planets is, so we've got an idea of how to look in the atmosphere, but it would be very interesting to find out what would be there on the surface as well. If we have a rocky planet like Mercury, Venus, Earth, or Mars, then there'll be a surface. And on most of that surface, assuming there's not a kind of liquid ocean covering the whole thing, or loads of biological material there as well, such as like soil on the Earth, then these planets will be covered in rocks. And this project that I was doing for my master's was all about trying to find out what minerals and what rocks would be present on the surface of these planets, and how would we be able to find out what it would be. It's very difficult to directly observe the surfaces of these planets. We can't really do anything like transmission spectroscopy to look at this. So if we're going to do this, we need to find a way of linking the composition of the atmosphere and what gases are in the atmosphere to what rocks are on the surface. Because as I say, we can get some information about what's in the atmosphere. So if we can somehow infer from what's in the atmosphere the minerals that might be on the surface, then that might be a viable way forward. Now, we can't do this for every planet. If we have a planet whose temperature is less than 600 Kelvin, or sort of 300, 400 degrees Celsius, then often there will be some water around on that planet. And that's going to severely complicate the interaction between the surface and the atmosphere. There are going to be all sorts of sort of weathering processes, there'll be different sort of evaporation processes. And if there's life on there, that will make things even more complicated. So this diagram here, for example, is what happens in the carbon cycle on Earth. And there are too many arrows to be able to study in a simple way. And this is just for one element, this is just for carbon. So if we've got a planet which is sort of relatively cold, we don't really have much hope for figuring out what's on the surface based on what's in the atmosphere, because they just interact in such a complicated way. If we have a planet which is really, really hot, more than 1,400 Kelvin, or 1,127 degrees Celsius, then we have another problem, which is that the whole surface will just be molten. This will be what's known as a lava world. And the reason that's bad is because there'll be all sorts of evaporation processes, and it'll be raining iron and things like that. These processes, which are sort of physically mixing the atmosphere and the surface, will again make this quite difficult to study when the planet is very, very hot. So we can't really go forwards if the planet is very, very cold or if it's very, very hot. But in the middle, it turns out there is quite a lot we can do. In the middle, it is likely that there is a process called thermochemical equilibrium, which is linking the composition of the surface to what's in the atmosphere. The way I would sort of sum up the phenomenon of thermochemical equilibrium is by the sense that all chemical reactions that can happen do happen. By can happen, I mean reactions which are allowed by the second law of thermodynamics, which you may have heard of, this idea that the entropy of the universe is always increasing. If any of you are doing chemistry A level, then you may be familiar with this quantity, the G, the Gibbs free energy. And you may know that the second law of thermodynamics means that this quantity, the Gibbs energy, must always be decreasing for any chemical reaction which is allowed. And by do happen, I mean these reactions happen very quickly. I mean, we've got very high temperatures here, and chemical reactions often proceed much more quickly at higher temperatures. And so this is really what we mean by this. So what we can do with this is we can say that if this equilibrium is in place, then all of the reactions which can happen have happened, and the Gibbs free energy, this quantity G, has reached its minimum possible value. If it were not at its minimum possible value, then there would be some reactions which could happen which would allow it to continue to decrease. And as I say, that would happen very quickly. And so the minerals which are present on the surface and the gases that are present in the atmosphere will be whatever set of gases and minerals would minimize this Gibbs quantity here, which is just a function of it just depends on how much of the chemicals are there, as well as pressure and temperature. Now this is all very well, but are there any planets where this sort of thing happens? And it turns out not only is the answer yes, we don't have to look very far to find a planet where this does happen. We think this is happening on Venus. Venus has these sort of temperatures where we think that the surface and the atmosphere are interacting chemically so quickly that this thermochemical equilibrium is established. Now, Venus is just one planet. It has a surface temperature of about 750 Kelvin and a pressure of nearly 100 bars. Earth, by the way, is about 1 bar, and Venus is sort of 100 times that. It's pretty insane surface pressure there. So what we wanted to do was have a look at a broader range of pressures and temperatures that might exist at the surfaces of other exoplanets and see how their chemistry in the atmosphere and surface might be linked together. And what we found was that there is this very abrupt boundary in the pressure and the temperature where some minerals just sort of stop being stable. So for example, this mineral here, this calcium sulfate mineral, is only stable when the pressure is sort of and the temperature are where we're sort of above this sort of arc-shaped boundary here. If the temperature is too high, then this or the pressure is too low, then this chemical will stop being stable. And we found similar consequences for certain other minerals, and a lot of them seem to follow the same boundary of stability. As for what's in the atmosphere, well, it turns out that what's in the atmosphere correlates very, very well with what would be stable on the surface. These are just simulations, but we find that wherever carbon dioxide is stable in the atmosphere, we would have calcium sulfate present on the surface. We would only have a bit of this second mineral, we would maybe have some of this third mineral, but we would have none of this final mineral here. Conversely, if we have some sulfur dioxide or some oxygen in the atmosphere, we know that we're on the other side of the boundary, and so we would have none of this calcium sulfate mineral, a bit more of this second one, none of this third one, and perhaps a bit of this final one. And what's exciting about this is that we should be able to tell the difference between an atmosphere which is full of carbon dioxide and an atmosphere which is full of sulfur dioxide. And so we should be able to tell from that which side of this boundary we're on, and therefore what minerals are there on the surface. This is just a sort of simulation of what some of these transmission spectra of these atmospheres might look like. And you can see that, for example, if we look at about 2.5 on the x-axis, there is a peak in these red lines which is not present in these blue lines. And so if we look at the sort of inset little square in here, if we're in the red zone, then that means there is none of this mineral here, calcium sulfate. If we're in the blue zone, then there is. So we would be able to tell by looking at these spectra, looking at some of the peaks here, which species are in the atmosphere, and as a result, which minerals might be present there on the surface. So this is pretty cool. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the habitability of exoplanets, since we're sort of getting towards the stage of being able to figure this out. So you may have heard of the concept of a habitable zone. This is the region around a star where it would be possible for life to exist. And so in this diagram, there is a sort of a habitable zone given here. Well, there's two. There's a kind of conservative one and an optimistic one. And there's a few planets, exoplanets dotted around here, which are in one or both of these nominal habitable zones. But there's something a bit weird about this, which is that if you look over the top left, then Mars is there. Mars definitely doesn't have any life there. There's no atmosphere. It would be impossible for life to exist. There's certainly no liquid water on the surface at the moment. There may have been in the past, but that's certainly not true today. The reason this is there, and the reason this is a bit of a shock, is because the habitable zone is a bit of a misrepresented concept. What we actually mean by the habitable zone is if we were to put Earth there with the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's liquid water and so on, would life still be able to be there? Would that liquid water in particular remain there? And it's true that if we put the Earth at the orbit of Mars, then there would still be liquid water there, and we could potentially still have life there. But just because we find any of these other exoplanets in this range here and in these habitable zones doesn't mean that there's life there any more than it means that there is life on Mars, which there unfortunately certainly isn't. But so not only does it necessarily mean that just because something is in the habitable zone doesn't necessarily mean it's inhabitable. I would argue that just because a planet is outside the habitable zone doesn't necessarily mean that there can be no life there either. I think that a lot of people are very biased when it comes to thinking about how habitable an exoplanet is. because naturally, we've only got one example of a planet with life on it. We only have one example of what life looks like. We only know about carbon-based life, which uses DNA, which is a very specific molecule. It has useful properties, but it's only, potentially there could be other ways life could emerge elsewhere. And so I think it's worth keeping an open mind as to what life could look like. It could look completely different to any kind of life that we know on Earth. These are some artists' impressions of life which exists solely in the atmosphere of its planet, feeding off the sunlight that could exist, that could power the life just existing in the atmospheres of its planet, never even necessarily needing a surface. Life on Earth has an incredibly rich diversity. You may have seen, absolutely bizarre examples of life on Earth in the deep oceans, for example. And there's no reason to think that if we look at a whole other planet, life would be similar to what we find on Earth. But as I say, we are in a very special period of our species' existence. For the first time in over 1 million years, we are at the stage where we are able to peer into the atmospheres of distant worlds. And using the James Webb Space Telescope as well as others, we are at a very pivotal moment in our species. And in my view, that means that we should all feel very, very lucky to be alive at this time. And I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for delivering such an amazing and informational talk. That was really good. Yeah. So I'll turn on the chat now. If students have any questions, they can pop them in there. I'll get the ball rolling now. So first question is, thoughts on the multiverse? Do you think it exists?
So the first thing I want to say is this is not my area at all. The second thing I want to say is that no one really researches it. It's sort of not a scientific question in a way, because like the multiverse by definition is something that exists outside of the universe in a sense. So given that we sort of live in the universe, there's no real way of looking at something outside there. And as a third point, I would say that if we do figure out that there are somehow, if we figure out that there are sort of multiverses out there in some sense, whatever that ends up meaning, then really I don't really see a reason to say that those are part of another universe. I think if we are able to find out that these places exist, then that sort of counts as our own universe. That's sort of the idea. So I think even if we find like quote unquote multiverses, which I frankly highly doubt, in my opinion, that would just still be our universe. The universe would just get a little bit bigger in our eyes.
One question from Prava. How do I start going towards a career in either astrology or aerospace? And also, what do you think about the supposed alien fossil that Mexico has discovered?
So, if you want to go for a career in astrology, Pravav, then I would suggest maybe like writing to your newspaper and finding out, what star sign you are. That would be a good place to start. I think presumably meant astronomy, right? So the first thing I would say is to make sure you learn the difference between those two things. And secondly, it would be firstly very useful to do very well in your physics and your maths, and then go to study physics or maths or astronomy at university. That would probably be the best thing to do. And looking at, there are loads and loads of really sort of inspirational YouTube videos and YouTube channels which focus on astronomy and would be a good place to start. The supposed alien fossil that Mexico has found, I haven't really looked into this because I know what you're talking about. I've seen pictures of this, but it's just so like the pictures just make it look so obvious that it's fake. So this is not, it's aliens I think probably exist, but I think the distances between different stars are just so vast that I really highly doubt that aliens have ever, visited here. And there's no reason to suggest that our planet is particularly special necessarily. So no, I think that's a load of rubbish, really.
Do you think humans will be able to find and live on another planet, potentially in our lifetime?
Find another planet, sure. I mean, we are potentially at the stage of being able to find habitable worlds sort of any day now. We're sort of at the stage where we can, look at other planets' atmospheres and have a look at them and see whether they might be sort of habitable for us. It's difficult. I mean, Mars. People are looking into ways of maybe terraforming Mars, or just not bothering and just living on Mars anyway. I think the main difficulty that you would overcome there would be if we're looking outside our solar system, then it would just take such a long time to get there. I mean, even like at the speed of light, if we wanted to go to the nearest star, that would take 4 years. And currently, we are certainly nowhere near getting anywhere near the speed of light. The light is like so fast. The distances between stars and the distances between planets are absolutely enormous. I think the planets I was talking about earlier, K218b, is over 1,000 light years away, which is absolutely ridiculous distance. So to answer the question, I guess find another planet, sure, maybe, but live on it. It would be very, very difficult and would require enormous technological breakthroughs. But I mean, within our lifetime, I mean, there are people alive today whose parents would have witnessed, well, maybe not witnessed, but would have heard about the first ever powered flight by the Wright brothers in America. And look where we are now with the internet and international flights and space travel and so on. Our technological development is proceeding exponentially fast. So perhaps let's not give up on that just yet.
Do you think machine learning would be ultimately beneficial or our downfall as mankind? What's the limit?
Again, I think I'm going to have to say this is not my area, and what I would suggest is turning up to the next talk where there is more of an expert in that sort of area. It's been beneficial to me. I got 2 quasars out of it, but I think the next person will probably have a bit more insight into that, I'm afraid.
Agreed. What's the hardest thing about astronomy?
The hardest thing about astronomy is that everything is really, really far away. It's the bottom line of it. It's not like biology, where if we're studying a frog, we can just find an example of that frog and then we can take it apart and examine it like that. For astronomy, we sort of just have to hope that whatever object we're looking at produces something that we can examine. So we only really can look at things which are emitting light towards us. That's sort of the limit of to what we can do. Certainly when we're studying some of these distant galaxies or even some of these distant planets, we can't really throw anything at them to see what they do, which is often what particle physicists do. They just kind of slam things together and see what happens. There's no real way of interacting with these. Even if we think about maybe finding life on this planet I mentioned, and if we tried to communicate with it, then that signal would take 1,000 years to get there. If there was someone there to reply, they would reply. Their reply would get back here 1,000 years later, at which time all of us would be long dead. So the most difficult thing about studying astronomy is that everything is just so horrendously far away.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll end on 2 questions from the chat. What machine learning model do you use for your project, and what was the coding language?
Yeah, good question. So the machine learning technique we were using, it was an unsupervised machine learning method called contrastive learning. This is quite a new technique. It was only announced it was developed by Google, and it was announced in, I think, the year 2020. So it's not been out for very long, and it's quite powerful at kind of aggressively separating out different groups of things. The programming language which was written in was Python. Astronomers are pretty much all just use Python these days. It's very, very easy to use and easy to collaborate on as well, which is very important. But there's a Python package which is very useful. There are a couple of Python packages designed for machine learning, but the one we used in this was called TensorFlow, which again is developed at Google.
Yeah. Final thing, if you're comfortable sharing, what are your career plans for the future? What do you hope to do after your PhD?
Well, I mean, I've got my PhD lasts 4 years, as I say, and a lot can change in that time. But currently, my kind of ideal path would be to continue into research and keep looking up at the stars for the rest of my career. It's kind of difficult with astronomy. It's not like some of my friends, for example, who study chemistry and are doing PhDs in chemistry. If they don't get a job in research afterwards, then there are a lot of companies which will pay them to do chemistry. Astronomy doesn't really have an industry. It's not it's not a very profitable science in the same way that like chemistry or material science, for example, is as well. So yeah, my current goal is to stay in research, perhaps maybe do some postdoctoral work abroad. I mean, one of the projects I did, I was actually doing in Heidelberg in Germany. But yeah, so my current goal would be to stay in research. But as I say, who knows?
Sounds great. So yeah, we'll close there. Thank you once again for delivering such an amazing talk. Students, if you're interested, the next talk is October 25th. It's on AI, machine learning, and he'll be talking about Chat GPT as well. So look out for that. And yeah, thanks everyone. Have a good evening. Hopefully see you soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.